Hello, I'm Musame Putra and I'm presenting my final year project entitled Logical Fallacies in Piers Morgan Uncensored Israel-Hamas War, Piers Morgan versus Bassem War in Palestine's Treatment. We are going to start with the introduction, research objectives and questions, literature review, and methodology. And this presentation will end by showing results, discussion, and conclusion. So, as Aristotle once said, a fallacious argument is an illusion created to make an argument sound. Therefore, it is important for people to be able to identify and categorize fallacies in arguments, because if not, fallacies could potentially manipulate people of how they perceive truth. This is especially important in the age of social media because social media has become more than a hobby and communication platform. We almost relied on it, and it's not even an exaggeration to say that we are addicted to it. So, when false news is being spread, most people won't search for peer reviewed journal articles to fact check it. People will most likely to look it up on social media, and that begs the question, what if social media, like YouTube, is filled with fallacies? To approach this research, I decided to focus on the ongoing conflict between Palestine and Israel. It should be important that people's view are not blinded by fallacies, and that is why I choose this video as my research content. Unlike any other social media content, this is a high-profile interview with millions of viewers. Therefore, it's important to study if there are fallacies in it. This interview was hosted by Piers Morgan, a British journalist known for his controversial views, and the main guest was Bassem Youssef, an Egyptian satirist and comedian. And there was also another guest who briefly appeared in the interview. His name is Jeremy Boring, the co-CEO of Daily Wire. I find this study important to many organizations and people because the knowledge of identifying and categorizing fallacies is beneficial, especially to those with critical thinking skills like debaters, educators, lawyers, and media literacy advocates. Before I continue, I should define some important terms like critical thinking, argument, fallacy, and social media. Critical thinking is a disciplined thinking process regulated by clear intellectual standards. Argument is a set of premises that will support a conclusion. Fallacy is a defective argument with logical errors, and social media is an online platform that enables users to create, share, and interact with content and each other. So the research objectives are to identify the logical fallacy used by the host, to identify the logical fallacy used by the guest, and to compare the use of logical fallacies by the host and guest in the video. And the research questions are: what are the logical fallacies used by the host? What are the logical fallacies used by the guest? And what are the similarities and differences in the use of logical fallacies by the host and guest in the video? So in literature review, we're going to observe the previous studies to justify the literature gap. But first, we need to know the most suitable framework to identify and categorize fallacies in the video. The framework that I considered were Paul and Elder critical thinking model, Tolman model of argumentation, Douglas Walton argumentation schemes, and Paul Grice's conversational maxims. Ultimately, I chose the framework by Bassem et al. From 2011 from their book entitled Critical Thinking, A Student's Introduction, 4th edition. According to the framework, there are 20 categories of fallacies, and I believe that this is the perfect and refined framework to identify and categorize these 20 categories of fallacies. Because in the same book, they explained about the standards of critical thinking, which are similar to Paul and Elder critical thinking model. Next, the book also explained the keys to imprecise statements, which are almost identical to Paul Gray's conversational maxim. And lastly, the book also explained the structure of an argument, which appears like a simplified version of Tolman model of argumentation and Douglas Walton argumentation schemes. Therefore, based on these similarities, it is reasonable to conclude that Bassem et al. 2011 wrote their ideas regarding fallacies, arguments, and critical thinking theories based on the mentioned framework and models. So, based on the video's transcription and the fallacies committed by the speakers, it is reasonable to theorize that their cultural background played a significant role. The host of the video, Piers Morgan, is English. The main guest, Bassem Youssef, is an Egyptian. The brief guest, Jeremy Boring, is an American. Considering their different nationalities, their cultural backgrounds should be studied to understand their arguments and behavior. Therefore, Hofstede's cultural dimension is a suitable framework to analyze each speaker's cultural background. There are 6 dimensions observed, which are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, term orientation, and indulgence restraint. And based on the previous study, there are literature gaps discovered which made this study to be more significant. For example, Brandsma 2023 did study about the identification of fallacies in YouTube posts, but it was not about Israeli-Palestinian war. Secondly, Teneva 2023 did study about identification of fallacies in the mainstream media, but it was not conducted in the YouTube platform. Thirdly, Azhari and Simanjunta 2023 did study about fallacies on the YouTube platforms, but it was based on the comment sections, not on videos themselves. Fourthly, Cohen, Akdad, and Shore 2023 did study about fallacies committed by Israeli politicians, but it was not regarding the Israeli-Palestinian war. And lastly, Al-Shara 2023 did study about fallacies committed by the Middle Eastern media, but it was not about the Israeli-Palestinian war. So it is worth noting that all of the mentioned research is only about identifying and acknowledging fallacies, but not categorizing them. Therefore, it can be concluded that in this content there are literature gaps because of the lack of research done about identification and categorization of fallacies on YouTube videos regarding the Israeli-Palestinian war. So the research design and the setting of the study involve the combination of both quantitative and qualitative of content analysis, which was a 30-minute long video entitled Piers Morgan versus Bassem Youssef on Palestine's treatment, which gained more than 20 million views since it was posted on YouTube on 18 October 2023. The qualitative method was used to identify, categorize, and compare the fallacies used by the speakers of the research video. A qualitative method was also used to investigate how each speaker's cultural background influenced their committed fallacies. Meanwhile, a quantitative method was used to count the amount and the frequency of fallacies committed by each speaker. Throughout the 30-minute video, there were about 6,000 words spoken by all of the speakers. About 1,700 words were spoken by Piers, and about 3,400 words were spoken by Bassem, and about 700 words were spoken by Jeremy. The sampling method used in this research is called purposive sampling, which was considered a non-random sampling method. The instrument and materials involved in this research are the framework by Bassem et al. 2011, which was to identify and categorize fallacies committed by each speaker. Meanwhile, another framework, Hofstede's cultural dimension, was used to investigate how each speaker's cultural background influenced the fallacy they committed. To describe the data analysis procedure, I went to the YouTube and searched for the title of the video that was published on the Piers Morgan Uncensored channel. I watched the entire video to fully understand the context of the video. Next, in the description of the video, I acquired the transcription, which was done automatically by YouTube. I copied the entire transcription and pasted it on a separate document. To ensure the accuracy of the transcription, I rechecked it while listening to the video over 6 times. To describe data analysis, a naturalistic observation method was used. I made a comprehensive table that labeled every 94 dialogues, its speakers, and the category of the fallacy committed. I also created tables that summarizes every dialogue, categories, and frequencies of fallacies committed for each speaker. This was done by referencing the Bassem et al. Framework. Finally, based on the data retrieved from the tables and according to Hofstede's cultural framework, I investigated how the cultural background of each speaker influenced the fallacies committed. So let's get to the results by answering our research questions. The first one is, what are the logical fallacies used by the host in the video? The host, Piers Morgan, committed 9 categories of fallacies for 24 units. Inconsistency, 7 units. Red herring, 6 units. And 2 units for inappropriate appeal to authority, ad hominem, 2 wrongs make right, appeal to pity, and 1 unit for strawman, false alternatives, and weak analogy. So Piers Morgan delivered 47 dialogues, or 1,756 words in the entire video. The fallacious arguments Piers Morgan committed consist of 829 words. Therefore, it can be concluded that roughly 47.21% of Piers Morgan's spoken words in the entire video are fallacious. The second question is, what are the logical fallacies used by the guest of the video? So Bassem Youssef, the main guest, committed 9 categories of fallacies for 15 units. 4 units in strawman, 2 units for inconsistency, appeal to pity, and hasty generalization, and 1 unit for inappropriate appeal to authority, loaded questions, weak analogy, false alternatives, and ad hominem. So the main guest, Bassem Youssef, delivered 43 dialogues, or 3,475 words in the entire video. The fallacious arguments by Piers Morgan Bassem Youssef committed consists of 1,048 words. Therefore, it can be concluded that roughly 30.158% of Bassem Youssef delivered dialogues in the entire video is fallacious. Meanwhile, the brief guest, Jeremy Boring, committed 4 categories of fallacies in 8 units. 3 units for red herring, 2 units in inconsistency, and 2 wrongs make right, and 1 unit in weak analogy. So Jeremy Boring delivered 3 dialogues, or 796 words in the entire video. The fallacious arguments Jeremy Boring committed consist of 636 words. Therefore, it can be concluded that roughly 79.90% of Jeremy Boring's delivered dialogues in the entire video is fallacious. So for the third research question is, what are the similarities and differences in the use of logical fallacies by the host and the guest? So for Piers Morgan and the main guest, Bassem Youssef, the similarities are they both committed inconsistency, inappropriate appeal to authority, ad hominem, appeal to pity, strawman, fallacy, false alternatives, and weak analogy at some point in the interview. Secondly, they both committed 9 categories of fallacies. They both committed the same amount of appeal to pity, false alternative, and weak analogy in the video. But the differences are Piers Morgan committed fallacy, and Piers' most committed fallacy is inconsistency, which is 7 units, and red herring, 6 units. While Bassem most committed fallacy is strawman, 4 units. Piers never committed hasty generalization and loaded questions like Bassem. Bassem never committed red herring and 2 wrongs make right like Piers. Piers committed 9 units of fallacies more than Bassem. Piers committed inconsistency fallacy 5 units more than Bassem. Piers committed inappropriate appeal to authority and ad hominem 1 unit more than Bassem. Bassem committed strawman 4 units more than Piers. For Piers Morgan and the brief guest, Jeremy Boring, the similarities are they both committed inconsistency, red herring, 2 wrongs make right, and weak analogy at some point in the interview. They both never committed hasty generalization and loaded questions, unlike Bassem. They both committed the same amount of 2 wrongs make right and weak analogy. However, the differences are Piers' most committed fallacy is inconsistency, 7 units, while Jeremy's most committed fallacy is red herring, 3 units. Jeremy never committed inappropriate appeal to authority, ad hominem, appeal to pity, strawman, and false alternatives, unlike Piers. Piers committed 16 units fallacy more than Jeremy. Piers committed inconsistency 5 units more than Jeremy. Piers committed red herring 3 units more than Jeremy. And that's it. So for the discussion and conclusion, firstly, Piers and Jeremy's low power distance culture influenced them to oppose hierarchical power of the USA, Afghanistan, and Hamas, but not Israel. Meanwhile, Bassem's high power distance culture does not stop him from condemning Israel and Western power. In other words, the power distance cultural dimension is not the absolute factor that influences these speakers' arguments. The fallacies they committed are not influenced by the power distance cultural dimension. So secondly, it can be inferred that Piers and Jeremy's individualistic culture influences them in committing some fallacies from the video because they wanted to preserve their individual image and personal argument. Meanwhile, Bassem's collectivistic culture influences him in committing some fallacies from the video because he relied heavily on his family member as a source of information. Thirdly, the masculine culture of these 3 speakers influences them in committing fallacies. To avoid any arguments that appeal to emotion, these speakers tend to cite other historical events that are quite irrelevant and incompatible with the Palestine-Israel war. And fourthly, the low uncertainty avoidance culture of Piers and Bassem has influenced the amount of fallacy committed by these speakers because they are more likely to take risk or not to be too formal among each other, as approaching uncertain results would not be a threat to them. And fifth, Piers' long-term orientation background influences him to commit fallacy as he tends to focus too far in the future when there is a solution that can be approached in the present. Meanwhile, Bassem's short-term orientation background influenced him to commit fallacies because he tends to make reckless and humorous contentions to have quick win in the argument. Lastly, Piers and Jeremy did not behave as the people from an indulgence-based culture because they did not value freedom in their arguments. Instead, they discussed about the necessity and inevitability of civilian death as the collateral damage of war. The fallacies they made are not influenced by their indulgence-based culture. Meanwhile, Bassem too did not behave as a person of a restraint-based culture because he used cursed words or profanity more than other speakers and recounted the situation using his own words and incorporating profanity to portray someone negatively. The fallacies he made were not influenced by his restraint-based culture. Therefore, it can be concluded that four cultural dimensions: individual collectivism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty avoidance index, and short-term long-term orientation influence the speaker in committing fallacies. Meanwhile, two cultural dimensions, power distance and indulgence restraint, did not influence them in committing fallacies. It is possible to argue that their power distance index did not influence their fallacy because each speaker's political beliefs supersede the cultural norm. Meanwhile, Piers and Jeremy did not behave as an indulgent-oriented person because they are trained professionals of journalism and politics. As for Bassem, he did not behave as a restraint-oriented because he is a satirist and comedian and spent some time in the USA long enough to gain citizenship. So Piers and Jeremy's most used fallacies were inconsistency and red herring. These two speakers share the same ideology and tend to shift the focus of a conversation. The most likely factor for them to behave this way are because of their individualistic tendencies to preserve their face, and also their masculine tendency to dominate the conversation, and also insufficient knowledge of histories of Israel's occupation since decades ago. Meanwhile, Bassem's most committed fallacies were strawman, where he tends to exaggerate his sources of information for comedic purposes. This is the most likely factors for him to behave this way is because of his collectivistic values, because his family are trapped and attacked in Gaza, and also because of his masculine tendency to dominate the conversation, and also because of his career background as a satirist to exaggerate to comedic purposes. So that would conclude my presentation for my final year project, and thank you for watching.